There should be a three dots.
Oh, yeah. Rename.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Alfred, you are recording, right?
Yes, it's recording.
Okay. All right, well, so let's begin. I want to welcome everybody to the Northwest Wayne Fans July Public Forum. I'm going to ask everybody to mute their speakers right now so that we don't get any feedback. So as you know from the flyer or our Facebook page, we have a wonderful program for you today. We've got 3 experts who are going to be speaking about addiction in 3 special populations: adolescents, college students, and seniors. Before we get started with that, I'm going to, for those of you who may not know that much about our organization, I want to share a little introductory information with you about who we are. So Families Against Narcotics is a nonprofit organization that our mission is to provide education, resources, and support to individuals and families who've been impacted by addiction. So there's about 20 chapters in Michigan, fan chapters, and we're the Northwest Wayne chapter. Our meetings are typically in Canton, but now, of course, because of the coronavirus pandemic, at least for the immediate future, we're having our meetings all online. So each fan chapter has monthly public forums that are educational in nature. Ours is the first Monday of every month. So this, of course, is our July public forum. Our fan chapter also has 2 support groups. Each support group meets twice a month. So we have a family and friends support group that for individuals who have loved ones who are struggling with addiction. That meets on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of every month. And right now, again, they're all meeting virtually. So that one's meeting by Zoom. We also have a grief support group for people who've lost a loved one to addiction. And that meets on the the 2nd and 4th Monday of every month. And again, it's meeting virtually. So for more detail in terms of times of meeting and more specific information, including the meeting ID and the password if you wanted to join those meetings, all of these meetings are in our events on our Facebook page. So we have a Northwest Wayne Families Against Narcotics chapter Facebook page. And again, our public forums are in events postings there, as well as our 2 support groups. So you can get more specific information about the programs, about each one of those meetings that way. I also wanted to share a little bit of information about FAN's annual fundraiser, Run Drugs Out of Town. Now this is a fundraiser that usually happens in June, a live event in Fraser at Fraser High School, and it is a huge event. There's over 2,500 people. I think it was close to 3,000 that attended last time. So it's a really fun event, but unfortunately this year, because of the coronavirus, we can't really do a live event. So instead we're doing a virtual Run Drugs Out of Town, and we're holding on a different day. We're doing it on August 29th. So people can register for this run just as though it were a live run, and then choose to run wherever they want on the date and time. So it's again August 29th from 9 to noon. We have in the past had our own team, our chapter does, and we have our own team again. So this year we're calling it Team Dakota Northwest Wayne in honor of our fan board member Andy Hobson's son, Dakota, who passed away from a drug overdose 3 years ago at the age of 21. There's an event posting on our Facebook page for this Run Drugs Out of Town event, and it gives you information about how you can register, and in particular about how you can register for our team. And of course, we encourage you to register for our team because this is a fundraiser, and any registrations go to, if you register for our team, it goes to our fan chapter. And you can also make donations to our team, which again would go to our fan chapter. So we'd love you to participate in this event with us. Another bit of introductory information, we have a YouTube channel. So it is NW Wayne Fan. And if you go to that on YouTube, we have all of these monthly forums recorded, live ones as well as these ones that are on Zoom, multiple topics relating to addiction and different experts speaking on the subject. So if you're interested in seeing what else we have, what other types of speakers we've had, you can go on that YouTube channel and check that out. Lastly, before I introduce our speakers for this evening, I want to share some sad news with you. With all the attention on the coronavirus, it might seem as though the opioid epidemic is taking a back seat, that it's not maybe a problem anymore almost. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the pandemic has made the opioid epidemic worse. People have had difficulty accessing treatment over the past months. The isolation and because of the stay-at-home orders, the social distancing, all of those things have made recovery more difficult to sustain. On July 2nd, one of Northwest Wayne Fan's founding board members, Lisa Sellinger, lost her son Joe to a drug overdose. He was 26 years old, a gentle, sweet, kind young man who had battled addiction to opioids for over 10 years. And he lost his battle to opioid addiction on July 2nd. And of course, his family and his friends are devastated. So I'd like for all of us to have just a moment of silence right now to honor Joe and his family. Thank you for that. Okay, it is now my privilege to introduce our speakers for this evening. Each speaker is going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then when they've all finished their presentations, there's going to be a time for questions. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each speaker first, and then after I get done introducing each one of them, I'm going to let them go ahead and give their presentations. So our first speaker this evening will be Scott Steenburgh. He's been employed in the healthcare field since early 2012. He's held various roles in several healthcare systems. Scott completed his under and postgraduate education at Wayne State University with a focus on social work. He's continued his education with the Mayo Clinic's Nicotine Dependence Center, and he's a certified tobacco nicotine treatment specialist. He helps oversee and facilitates the adolescent substance use programming at Rivers Bend PC in Troy, including the intensive outpatient group and alternative peer group therapies. Scott's employed as an adjunct faculty at Oakland Community College in the Social Sciences Department, teaching courses on mental health and social work. And he's also contracted with the American Association of Addiction Psychiatry as a recovery subject matter expert. Scott's passionate about helping people and families find and sustain recovery, and he's going to be speaking on the subject of adolescence and addiction. Our second speaker will be Matthew Statman. He is the manager of the University of Michigan Collegiate Recovery Program. He's also an adjunct lecturer at Eastern Michigan University School of Social Work. He's a private social work practitioner and a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. Matt earned his bachelor's degree in social work from Eastern Michigan University and his master's degree from the University of Michigan School of Social Work. He is a licensed master social worker and a certified advanced alcohol drug counselor. He's also a person in recovery from a substance use disorder who spent his career helping those with substance use disorders initiate and sustain recovery. And then finally, we have our own Northwest Wayne Advisory Board member, Carl Christensen. Dr. Christensen has stepped in to save us once again. We originally had Dr. Michael Sikorsky, who was planning to speak. He's a pain specialist, but Dr. Sikorsky had an emergency and informed us on Friday that he wasn't able to speak. So thankfully, Dr. Christensen is willing and able to come and speak instead on the subject of seniors and addiction. Dr. Christensen's a board-certified addiction medicine specialist. He serves as the medical director for the Michigan Health Professional Recovery Program, which monitors impaired nurses, pharmacists, and doctors. He's also the medical director of Dawn Farm, a highly respected addiction treatment facility in Ann Arbor. Dr. Christensen has served as medical director of the Eleanor Hutzel Women's Recovery Center, an outpatient program dedicated to caring for pregnant, chemically dependent women, and as the medical director at the Tolan Medical Research Clinic at the Department of Psychiatry at Wayne State University. He has received numerous teaching awards and was named one of the top docs in addiction medicine by ARHE magazine. He is a frequent speaker on the subject of addiction and the brain, often for us. And he sits, again, as I said, on Northwest Wayne Fans Advisory Board. So with all of those introductions, I'm now going to turn the program over to Scott Steenburgh to begin the presentations. Go ahead, Scott.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. And thank you, Lauren, for the opportunity to speak. And Elise, if you can hear me somewhere out there, also to you. I just want to say quickly before I get started that I have an 11-month-old son outside the door here, making lots of weird sounds. If you hear that in the background, try to ignore it the best you can. I have nowhere else I can go, so this is kind of what we're going to deal with. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here and just kind of share a little bit about, you know, the work that I do, and I think is for me takes on an extra note of sincerity, just hearing about what happened with your board member's family this past weekend, and my heart goes out to them. You know, particularly when you talk about him passing away at 26 and then getting started with the addiction issue in his teens, you know, and I know for me too, a person in long-term recovery from an addiction issue, started, you know, using drugs when I was young, experimenting with drugs and alcohol when I was young. And so, it definitely, is an issue that's present with me. So anyway, let me go ahead and share my screen. I've got some slides. Oh, am I allowed to share?
What's that?
So
Alfred had, I think, made it so you're able to share. Can you?
No, it's, oh, now I can. Thank you very much.
Okay.
There you go. Okay.
Perfect. Here we go. So yeah, let me get you to the front of my slides. So yeah, Ritter's Bend PC, for those of you that have never heard of us, we're a small clinic in Troy, Michigan. We are kind of a bustling.
Your other toilet.
Sorry about that. So we've got, you know, 15 to 18 therapists. We do programming for mental health. We do programming for substance abuse for both adults and then adolescents. And I kind of help out with the Adolescent Intensive Outpatient there. Almost all of our services right now are being done virtually through Zoom. If you guys are interested in finding out more about that, you can check out the website or give them a call or shoot me an email. Also, if anyone is interested after and would like anything to do with these slides or more information, you can shoot me an email or a text message or whatever. So anyway, just a quick overview of, you know, the ASAM definition of addiction, and so I don't want to speak too much about this stuff because I don't want to steal any thunder from Matt or Carl, Dr. Christensen. I do know. Hold on. So I'm a huge fan of both of the work that both of those guys do. So I'm really excited to hear them. So I'm going to try to buzz through this so I can be quiet and let you guys listen to these guys. But this is kind of a long, wordy definition. The part that hits home for me, particularly when we talk about adolescence, is really this middle part where it says, you know, this is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and/or relief by substance use and other behaviors. That particular part of pursuing reward and relief is the thing that I think we need to focus on. You know, a lot of times with the adolescent population, you'll get them saying things like, well, you know, you talk about drug or alcohol use. Well, okay, fine. Maybe I have a problem with marijuana, but alcohol is not my problem. Or maybe I have a problem with opioids or cocaine, but marijuana is not my problem, you know. And I always try to get them to see, like, really what we're talking about is we're talking about a biological condition here. You know, there are other facets to it, but we're talking about a condition that's existing underneath the symptoms of the chemical use, right? Or the compulsive behavior. And that's the thing that I think is really important to note. So criteria for diagnosing of these 11, I don't know if you guys can see, let me try and move you over here. Here they are, using more of the substance over a longer period than intended. Whoops. Persistent and unsuccessful desires to stop or cut down, spending a lot of time getting, using, or recovering from the use of the substance, 4 cravings for that substance, failure in roles at work, school, or at home, particularly with adolescents in school. 6, use despite interpersonal relationship problems. 7, giving up important social, occupational, recreational activities because of the use. 8 would be recurrent use in hazardous situations like swimming in a pool, having unprotected sex, driving a car, operating heavy machinery of any kind. Continued use despite physiological health problems. 10, needing more of the substance to get the same effect or increased tolerance. and then the development of withdrawal symptoms, right? And so if you have 2 or 3 of those, we can classify it as mild. If you have 4 to 5, it's moderate. 6 or more is severe. Now, I wish I could give you hard numbers for what we see with adolescents on, are they more moderate or severe? I can tell you with the level of care that I practice at, they're going to be more to the higher end of moderate to severe. So I help oversee this intensive outpatient program. And so basically what that looks like is 9 clinical hours per week. So 3 days per week, 3 hours each day. And what we'd be looking for is someone who doesn't quite need to go to a residential level of care, an inpatient level of care, because they don't need to manage withdrawal symptoms or anything like that, but needs a little more than just seeing an individual therapist 1 or 2 times a week. So they're going to need a little bit more structure, a little bit more support. And so for me, I end up seeing the folks that are a little bit more on the higher moderate side to the more severe side. Time. I wanted to pull up some stats for you guys just to show you what's current as far as for this age group. So this particular stat, though, from 2017 is all illicit drug use. It doesn't have alcohol on here. It'll have it on the next slide for the age groups 12 and up. But what I thought was really important is still the most widely used drug here is marijuana. Now, we hear about the opioid epidemic, and absolutely I'm not taking away from that or diminishing the opioid epidemic in any way, shape, or form. I'm going to click on that. Are you guys still able to manage the waiting room while I do this? I don't know if you are, so I'm just going to do that. So I find it to be really interesting because, still what we're having is people are starting with marijuana. And I think more so now here in the state of Michigan with the passage of recreational marijuana use, we're going to see, I don't necessarily like to get into the debate about whether or not marijuana should be legal or not, but what we're going to see is an uptick in people who have this issue, the addiction issue. They're going to be identified earlier and probably more frequently because they're going to have easier access to drugs and drugs that are stronger, right? The THC that's being used with our population today is really, it's not even really marijuana as much as it's THC, and it has a more pronounced effect on the body. But this particular slide, we can kind of look at it in age groups. So the red bars are what we're talking about. So the most, this is past year initiates. So the first time they're initiating drug or alcohol use. In the age group of 12 to 17, it's alcohol. That's the most frequently first used drug. And then closely behind that, marijuana and then cigarettes. And I would imagine if you look at newer research, 2018 and on, you're going to see an uptick in tobacco use or cigarette use through the use of e-cigarettes. We've had a huge spike in e-cigarette use in the last couple of years.
Well, plus, the
really,
first thing you do is alcohol, and then marijuana, and then cigarettes. Wow.
Okay, so this is a less wordy definition of addiction, but I like it a lot. Addiction is a brain disease expressed in the form of compulsive behaviors. Part of the reason I have brain stuff on here isn't so much to get into the brain science of addiction, but I think it's really important when we talk about adolescence to talk about the adolescent brain, right? And so, a very simplified way to look at it is that the reward pathway between the middle part of the brain and the prefrontal cortex is disrupted in folks who have an addiction issue, right? And the way that the brain cells communicate with each other through neurotransmission, with dopamine, serotonin, GABA, and any of the multitude of neurotransmitters that exist in the brain, gets affected. And so basically when we talk about dopamine, let me see if I can move this little box. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter most commonly associated with pleasure. And basically the long and short of how that goes is drugs in the brain will cause the release of dopamine and prevent its reuptake, giving the user a feeling of euphoria and excitement. Eventually the brain will adjust to the overabundance of that by shutting down the dopamine receptors, sometimes resulting in dopamine depletion, giving someone a down or uneasy mood, and then they will eventually become dependent on the drug to get that production of that dopamine and serotonin. And so when that happens, the person is essentially hooked. So here's a great slide that shows the brain's reward pathway from the middle part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, the VTA, which is really like the house. What we could call it is the
Michael,
rat brain or the
Sikorsky.
Hey, this is Lauren, and sorry to interrupt, Scott. Could people please mute their mics other than Scott? We're hearing other people talking, which is not helping with the presentation. So unless you're Scott Steenburgh, please mute your mic. Thank
Wait,
you.
Scott Steenburgh, who's that? I don't see his name on here.
I'm asking the person who just is talking right now to mute. Thank you.
Okay, so the reward pathway is, really like what we're talking about in the implication in addiction, right? So that inner rat brain or lizard brain that where all of the dopaminergic molecules are produced, and the prefrontal cortex where the seat of reason exists and the ability to kind of make sound decisions, right? Not act on impulse, things like that. So the thing that's really important to note with adolescence is this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, isn't really developed until you're like in your 20s, maybe early 20s to mid 20s, I think is a good research that I've seen. And so, before you get to that age, you literally don't have the ability to use abstract thinking, at least not the way you will once you've matured, right? To use, you don't have executive function, right? And there's a slide that kind of describes what executive function is. And so, oh, by the way, there are a few things that you can be exposed to in your life that will stop or hinder the development of that part of the brain. And one of those is chemical substance use. And when we talk about addiction issues, largely to be considered like a pediatric disorder, most of it happening between 18 and 25, of the percentage that fall in that class that became addicted between 18 and 25, about 90% of them will have started using chemicals before age 17. And so that chemical substance use can kind of inhibit that and arrest that development. And the exposure to trauma, direct, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, or just the witnessing of that or growing up in a traumatic environment can also stop that. If you kind of have both of those together, you really prime that person for an addiction issue. You add in genetics to that mess, and I think they're kind of like a sitting duck. If they pick up a drink or smoke a joint, they're probably going to have an issue. Anyway, so here's the activation of the reward pathway by the addictive drugs. What I think is important to know about the adolescent population, you look at the area, the nucleus accumbens, right in this area here, and it's lit up by heroin, and it's also lit up by nicotine. And one of the things that I think leaves adolescents at risk is to, they start with nicotine, right? Especially now with vaping, it's so readily available and easy to use. So you find yourself in a situation where you're walking through school or maybe it's after school and you're with a group of kids and everybody's kind of doing that, and they ask you if you want to, and so you're peer pressured to some degree to connect and want to fit in, and you go ahead and you do that. You begin using nicotine. Nicotine is going to prime that area and make you more likely to become addicted to other chemicals once you have the opportunity to take them. Now, that's not 100% of the time going to mean that if you try using nicotine, you're going to become a heroin addict. That's not what I'm trying to say, but it's going to prime that area and it's going to make things more likely to occur. And so I saw a study recently that was done around the time that Colorado legalized marijuana. And what it was trying to prove is that marijuana would have, or the legalization of recreational and medical marijuana use would have a positive effect on the opioid epidemic. And what they ended up finding out is that actually the legalization, because once you try the nicotine, you're more likely to try cannabis, and once you try that, you're more likely to actually go on to try other opioid drugs. And if you try an opioid drug, you become more likely to die from an opioid overdose death. So the extrapolation there is if you try the nicotine, you become more likely to die of an overdose death. And so anyway. So here we have a kind of an overview of the brain. This is a colleague of mine who lives in Texas who has so nicely allowed me to show her 80s hair here when she was 20 years old. So the prefrontal cortex, and it shows you that area. And basically what it's saying is the blue represents the maturing of the areas of the brain. So you can see where you're at age 5 over to age 20. And here's a better view of it. So age 5, 12. And so this is really the area that I'm seeing, folks. We once in a great while will get somebody as young as 12. It's generally about 14 to 17. And so you can see that area is really underdeveloped. It's not to where it would need to be at age 20. And what that leads to is the inability to use executive function, right? So abstract and conceptual understanding, impulse control, problem solving, decision making, poor judgment, difficulty with emotional regulation, frustration tolerance, and then, the ability to feel empathy. And so that, from my perspective, can make working with adolescents hard. Not all the time, but it can. And so what's the answer? We talk about motivation for change, and I think it's important to talk about when we're dealing with addiction treatment, the trans-theoretical model for change, looking at somebody's internal readiness and where are they at? Are they in the pre-contemplation stage where they're maybe not necessarily in denial, but it's not even on the radar, right? They don't think they have an issue. And I think for adolescents, we see a lot of folks who are there. Their parents see that they have an issue, or maybe the courts see that they have an issue, or the school has caught them and see that they have an issue. But it's, from my perspective, pretty rare that we get a young person who comes in and says, hey, I feel like I have a problem. Although it does happen, right? The contemplation stage of change is next, where maybe there's some ambivalence back and forth on the fence. I can see why it's a problem, but I don't necessarily want to stop. We also see a lot of the younger people in that stage of change. The preparation stage of change, I've decided I have this problem. I know I need to take action to change it, and what am I going to do about it? And then, of course, getting into action. You can see the time frames on there. The action stage of change happening right at about 6 months. And so there's another stage of change that we could kind of insert under action when we talk about the adolescent population, and that's called coerced action, meaning that, largely the percentage of folks that we're going to see in the treatment industry that are adolescents are going to be forced to be there, as I said, by parents or by the courts or by somebody else is going to force them to be there. And so that is largely what I deal with. And that can be a complicated issue to treat. So coerced action from that perspective almost never works from what I see. But coerced action from another perspective does work. And what I mean by that is, okay, so what are our options for solutions to this problem with the adolescent population? We get them in front of a clinician and assess them and see where they need to be. If they need detox, that's the most important thing, to see where somebody's at. What kind of drugs are they using? Is it going to be a threat to their lives to try and get them off of those drugs, whether they're using alcohol or benzodiazepines or opioids? Once we know where they fit, whether it's inpatient, residential, or the outpatient level of care, we can get them to the appropriate facility, and whether they need individual or group therapy or family therapy. But when I talk about coerced action, what I'm largely talking about would be the alternative peer group program. So we have one of those at Rivers Bend PC, and what it really is aiming to do is create a positive environment for kids that makes recovery look enthusiastic and fun. It makes it look like a decent time, because I think a lot of times with young people, if you take away the drugs and the alcohol, right, it's almost like you're taking away an American rite of passage, right? You mean to tell me I can't drink at my graduation party when I graduate from high school? Or you mean to tell me I can't, and there's all of these, it's almost like a grieving period. You start to look at all of the loss that will happen in your life. And so if somebody is going to stay sober or abstinent, whatever that looks like for them, I think it has to look attractive to them. And so coerced action from another perspective would be, you have other young people, peer-led groups that are able to look at them and kind of pull them in with positive peer pressure. And that's really the environment we've tried to create at Rivers Bend, is to have that positive peer pressure where kids are encouraging each other to stay sober. They're encouraging each other to, to not vape, to do all these things that are maybe a more healthy alternative to the life they've been living. And then, of course, recovery high schools are a great option. I think there's been some buzz and some talk about them here in the state of Michigan for a little while. I think we're finally going to see that happen. There are two groups that I know that are working to make it happen. One is in St. Clair County, and then I think Oakland County is going to get one pretty soon here. And so I'm pretty excited about that, and to be able to work and refer back and forth. And what that looks like is, literally a high school that's centered on people who are trying to stay abstinent from drugs and alcohol. And in theory, moving them on to, collegiate recovery programs, which I won't even touch on. I'll let Matt talk about for sure, because because that's his area. And then eventually to the adult mutual aid supports. And so what I think is really important with the alternative peer group program is that it is a team-based program, that it has a clinician and it has peer recovery coaches that are there in the group with them. And because I think it's a far stretch to give a loose referral to a 14-year-old girl and say, hey, go to Alcoholics Anonymous. And she goes and she sits down with, 55-year-old men at a table somewhere. I'm not saying that she can't get what needs to be gotten there, but I don't necessarily know that that's the first place I'm going to send her. You know what I mean? And so anyway, that's the work that we are trying to do at Rivers Bend is really offer a supportive environment for young people who want to do something different in their lives. I look back at my personal recovery journey, and it started when I was young. I got in trouble when I was 14, and I know for sure that had I had access to any of the programs that I'm talking about, things may have been different, and so that's kind of really where my passion lies, and I think that's all I have. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks so much, Scott. Really appreciate it. I imagine some people have some questions. I know I wrote one down just now, but I'm going to wait. We're going to kind of go through each of the speakers, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end. So thanks a lot for that information. And Matt, you want to take over?
Yes, thank you. Can you enable my ability to share some slides, please?
Are you seeing that you can or can't?
It says I can't right now.
All right. This is Alfred's job. Where is he? Alfred, are you still with us?
Yes, one moment.
Okay, thanks. I'll get started. Just start talking. We'll catch up with the slides.
There you go.
Oh, I'm host now. Cool. I take that back. Boom. Are you seeing my slides now?
I'm not seeing them, no.
Okay.
No,
Not yet. Here they are.
there we go.
Okay, cool. All right, so thank you for asking me to speak. It's good to be here. I appreciate any chance I can get to talk about my job. I love my job, and I love the students I work with. So I'm going to really quickly go over who am I, why do we do collegiate recovery, a little bit about campus, and what makes campus a special place for recovery, and I'm going to talk briefly about the Association of Recovery in Higher Ed and what they are doing around collegiate recovery. And then I hope to be able to answer any questions that you may have afterward. So why isn't this working? Oh, there we go. So I'll tell a quick story. I like to tell this story because I think it illustrates at least part of the reason why we do collegiate recovery. So I'm a person in recovery. I got into recovery when I was 32 years old in 2002. I had a long history of addiction. It was a nightmare. I'm incredibly grateful to be in recovery. After about 5 or 6 years in recovery, I had been working at a detox center in Ann Arbor, and I decided I wanted to go to college and become a social worker. And so I went to Eastern and I got an undergraduate degree in social work. And I was a proud and very involved member of the recovery community in Ann Arbor. I worked in the field. I talked about recovery. Most of my friends were in recovery. I did a lot of things as a person in recovery. And as I got accepted to the University of Michigan for the master's program, I started talking to the people around me about sort of self-disclosure in the collegiate environment. Should I tell my peers and my professors that I was in recovery when I went to school? And this was over 10 years ago. But at that time, most of the people in the recovery community in Ann Arbor who I talked to said, you got to be careful with that self-disclosure stuff. You should probably just keep your mouth shut and not tell anybody that you're in recovery on campus. And so I went to U of M with that in mind. And within my first few weeks in school, I started running into people I knew from the recovery community at the school. And one of the people I ran into, I was in the library, this very quiet space, and she approached me and said, hey, Matt, we're starting a student org called Students for Recovery, and we want you to be a part of it. And she said it enthusiastically, and she said it with some volume, and it freaked me out. I looked around the room to see who else might have heard that I was in recovery. I felt myself sort of getting anxious and sweaty and my face flushing. And I walked out of there, and later upon reflecting, I realized, you know, something that's so important to me, identity-wise, should not be something that I feel weird about disclosing on a college campus. And that is stigma, right? That is internalized stigma, and that's stigma from the outside. And so that's part of the reason why we do this work, because there's so much stigma, especially for young people, I think. So we do it to bust stigma. We are part of student life at University of Michigan, and students' life job is to help students succeed however they show up. And there are students who show up in recovery, and there's students who show up needing recovery. And so our job is to help them succeed at life, learn about not only what they've come to school primarily to learn about, which is whatever they're majoring in, but also learn about how to be whole, well, content human beings. College campuses are recovery hostile environments. I will talk about that in a minute. Recovering students are marginalized. I tell students all the time, if you're a college student and you're at a party and you're drinking, or you're going out with friends after a class and you're drinking, no one's ever going to ask you, why are you drinking? But if you are not drinking in any environment on a college campus, you will definitely be asked why you're not drinking. So substance use is presumed to be the norm on campus, which others people who don't use substances. So recovering students are marginalized in that way and in other ways. They're left out of opportunities. There's networking that happens in professional programs and graduate programs at bars. There's a common saying that you can't be an alcoholic while you're still in college, or people are frequently asked, you're too young to be, you're too young to have a problem like this, or whatever. Education is recovery capital. So not only do I worry about the students who are at U of M who are in recovery and trying to help them stay in recovery, but there's a whole community of people in recovery in Ann Arbor who have amazing lives ahead of them. And I believe that everyone who wants to have access to an education should have access to higher education. And for people in recovery, it can provide purpose and meaning in their lives and hope for a better and different future. So there are access issues. I'll say it now. I was going to say it at the end. I was going to talk about the fact that Washtenaw Community College just got a collegiate recovery program. I think that's amazing, because just because of the admissions requirement at U of M, it excludes a lot of people in recovery right off the bat. But if they can go to WCC and be part of a collegiate recovery program and get some 4.0s, which people in recovery do all the time, and then they can transfer in if they choose to. And also this idea about recovery management. Scott talked about recovery being a chronic illness for a lot of people. And it's been shown that people who have support over the long term do better in recovery. Their outcomes are better. And we are privileged and fortunate enough to be able to provide to our students as a perk for being a student at University of Michigan, recovery management that spans not only like the entirety of their college career, but we can allow alum to keep coming as long as they want after they graduate. So this is a population that has the privilege of having what everyone should have. This is the college story. This is what part of what people think about when they think about going to college, or when they think about what happens in college. I'm 90% sure these were taken on our campus. And so this is what our students have to walk through on Saturday morning to get to work or to get to an AA meeting. And although most students on most nights are not using substances, and most students, when they do use substances, are not out of control with substances, the loudest story is this story. And that creates its own reality. You know, you don't hear, on Monday morning, you're not sitting in class hearing people talk about their weekend sitting at home and studying and not doing anything. You're hearing people talk about the parties and the blackouts and the craziness. And so again, that's sort of part of what marginalizes people in recovery, or other people who choose to abstain. This is from the Monitoring the Future. This is some data from Monitoring the Future. There's a lot of different data out there about this age group. And we have some data that's more specific to U of M students. The primary substances that our students in recovery used and had problems with when they were using is alcohol, overwhelmingly, number one. Cannabis is second, and amphetamines are third. Those are the three top drugs that our students are in recovery from. You'll notice from some of these stats that the cannabis vaping among college students is going way up. And this is 2 years ago, so I'm sure it's even higher now. We're also having just cannabis use in general is going up. Actually, binge drinking has been going down a little bit. And so has use of other like prescription opioids. And so this study looked at treatment utilization among college-age adults. And there's a whole paper on this, but the bottom line is that full-time college students are way less likely to seek help than their non-college or part-time college peers. So the population that we are working with at University of Michigan do not seek help for substance use disorders, even though they have similar, or in some cases higher rates of substance use disorder than their non-college peers. They don't seek help. So this is what one student said. The college environment can be very hard because it seems like everyone my age is expected to drink. They found out that's not true, hopefully from being in collegiate recovery. Ann Arbor, being a college town, is riddled with liquor stores, so alcohol is not only available, it's right in front of your face at all times. And they also go on to talk about the stress of school and how that can be triggering for them. And then this is another student who talked about how many different responsibilities they have, and the need to prioritize their recovery meetings and their other recovery activities in the midst of all the other stuff they have to do. And we commonly in the recovery community, we're saying, keep your recovery first. Everything you put in front of your recovery, you're going to lose. And that is true, but it's also true that if you don't do well on your finals, that's going to be problematic. So we're trying to balance a lot of competing priorities and responsibilities and keep recovery first. And it looks to them like all the other students are just having a blast, you know? So at the University of Michigan, we're part of Wolverine Wellness, which is part of student life. And we have a whole comprehensive approach to addressing and trying to prevent substance use harms, and substance use disorders. And so we differentiate, you know, a lot of students are going to use substances. Some of those students are going to experience harm from substances. And some of those students are going to have substance use disorders. And Wolverine Wellness, it's our job to address all of that stuff. And we do that in a lot of ways. Recovery support is a very specific program for a very specific population. And so we do, in Wolverine Wellness, we do social norming and messaging, trying to get students to reduce harm or avoid harm from use. We do a lot of wellness coaching, which is where some of our recovery students come from. It's a brief intervention. It's 2 sessions. Students at University of Michigan can sign up for it. And they sit in front of a health educator or a social worker, and they talk about their lives, and they set goals, and they make strategies to try to adhere to those goals in order to avoid negative consequences. And most students who are using substances can do that successfully. The ones who can't probably need referrals to treatment and eventually will need to be in recovery. This is the lounge that we have. This was taken last fall. It's not going to look like that this fall. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like this fall, but we might have like 3 people in there instead of 25, which is unfortunate. And this is our mission. We provide holistic support to students who are in recovery, and we are not a clinical treatment program. So if a student needs treatment, we get them a referral to treatment, or we ideally get them into treatment. And sometimes they can do it in conjunction with Collegiate recovery. Sometimes they have to go away somewhere and then return to the supportive community that we provide on campus. It really depends where they're at. And so we try to foster peer support. We try to reduce stigma. We try to provide information to students and consult with them and their families. We try to talk to faculty and staff about how to talk to students about substance use, because they are on the front lines. A lot of advocating for social activities that are not revolving around substances. And we have the space, and they have me and the whole Wolverine Wellness team who they can come to if they need to talk to people. So I talked about the community building, hedonic rehabilitation. I just like to use that word. It means fun. We're dealing with young people whose whole lives often revolved around substances and the fun that they had, at least initially, when involved with those substances. And so a big part of recovery for young people is learning how to have sober fun, and also having the patience to let their brains heal enough that normal rewards become rewarding for them. And the community that they build, that we help them build with other students who have been through that, can provide hope and encourage them to be patient in those early days when it's really kind of nightmarish. So we talked about all that. Students come to us in a lot of different ways. We get some students who are already in recovery in Ann Arbor, often transferring from WCC or EMU. They got sober in Ann Arbor. They live in transitional housing often. And so they already have a support system in Ann Arbor. They have different needs when they get to campus. Then we get students who are in stable recovery who are coming from out of town. They they have needs that include getting plugged into the recovery community, both on and off campus, which is an added thing to do that the students who are already in recovery in Ann Arbor don't have to do. We get students who are U of M students and who are returning from treatment, and they have to be connected with the recovery community. They also have the problem of having had so many experiences as a University of Michigan using substances, and they have friends who on campus who use substances. So they have their own set of stuff. We have students at U of M who enter recovery without treatment. They sometimes just start going to mutual aid meetings and become involved with collegiate recovery, and they can stay sober. And then we have students who come to me and they obviously need clinical care, and we can help them get time off to do that. And they can participate in collegiate recovery while they have time off. Often they have to go to a treatment center for a while, and then they can return and participate in collegiate recovery. So there are a lot of different pathways to our program. Mostly we get students who self-refer or are there by word of mouth from other students. We also have parents who look us up, colleagues around the university, mostly wellness coaches who refer to us. And there are some treatment centers who, when they get a student from University of Michigan, will refer to us as well. The Association of Recovery in Higher Ed is the sort of like governing body for collegiate recovery. I used to be on the board. We're now members, but I was too busy to remain on the board. They've developed some standards for CRP. They do some advocacy around the country for the development of CRP. They really support professionals who are in our field. It's a relatively new field. And we have a diverse group of professional staff who come from all different backgrounds. We have people who've primarily worked in higher ed. We have people who are social workers like me. We have people who are public health people. And so all different kinds of professionals working together in this field. And the Association of Recovery in Higher Ed helps support us all. And there's a national conference, which is a great scene every year. Unfortunately, this year it had to be on Zoom, but it's really offered a lot of support to me over the year. This is the definition that Association of Recovery in Higher Ed has for collegiate recovery, but it's basically a space for students who decide to engage in a lifestyle of recovery on a college campus. And to ensure that they don't have to sacrifice their recovery for their education or their education for their recovery. And so here are the standards for ARHE that ARHE has set as ideals for collegiate recovery programs. Most programs don't start like this. Most programs start in some small way, often with a student org or a passionate faculty or staff person who does it in their free time, whatever that means. The ARHE standards say that these spaces should be for students who aren't choosing to moderate substances, but rather choosing to abstain. That abstinence can include medications that are prescribed for substance use disorder as long as they're not being misused. They're housed within higher ed institutions. They're nonprofits. We believe strongly that they should be free to students as part of what they get as being on campus. They should have dedicated staff. Ideally, they should have space. Space is a game changer. We have a space that's accessible to our students 24/7. So they can come down there whenever they want and study or hang out and watch TV, drink coffee, etc. And we do a lot of collaborating with on and off campus partners too. So I think I'm gonna skip this because I kind of went over a lot of this stuff. And I talked about how the students are marginalized. There are different models for collegiate recovery around the country. Some are actually clinical. So some collegiate recovery programs have therapists who do clinical work with the students. That's not what we have here at University of Michigan. There are probably a couple hundred collegiate recovery programs around the country at this point. Some have housing that is specific to the students who are in collegiate recovery. We do not have that. Michigan State has it. Ohio State has it. Penn State has it. So they have housing that is recovery housing. It's different than substance-free housing. It's almost like a step down from transitional housing where there are expectations around recovery for the students who live there. Some programs have minimum sobriety requirements. We don't, but some programs have a 6-month or a 1-year minimum sobriety requirement for students. Some collegiate recovery programs have specific tracks for people whose primary recovery is mental health or eating disorders. Of course, working with this population, we have mental health and eating disorders and other compulsive or addictive behaviors. But some programs have enough staff and resources to do the primary work with some of those populations. Some are more of a drop-in or a resource center. Some are housed in academic units, like schools of public health or schools of social work. Some are in student life like we are, and some actually engage allies around this work. So people who aren't in recovery but who are supportive of recovery have loved ones in recovery, and they may support those students. So here's a couple things that some of our students have said sort of as they have been engaged with collegiate recovery for a while. It is really a game changer for a lot of young people. It really helps them feel like they belong on campus and they're seen on campus and they're not alone on campus. And that's what we hear from students over and over again. So, at the end of every spring, we have a graduation, which is just like the most emotional thing I've ever seen in my life. I'll zip through some of this so we can get to Carl, but it's basically like, you're doing a great job, keep doing it. And then in the state of Michigan, Washtenaw just started one about, I think it was around last fall. Really excited about that. EMU has been trying, students have been trying really hard. There are some faculty and staff who are also pushing for it. It hasn't been fully institutionalized there, which we're hoping that happens at some point. I think it's inevitable, but it hasn't happened yet. Michigan State has a great collegiate recovery program, and Central and Ferris, and I'm sure there are a couple other ones around the state that I'm not thinking of. But this is if you think about sort of the continuum of services for people with substance use disorders, recovery support is the piece that has been traditionally missing from acute care models of addiction treatment. And it is so important, and collegiate recovery is really situated well to provide recovery support for long-term recovery management for people who are enrolled in colleges. And I think everyone should have access to that. Here are some resources. The Association of Recovery in Higher Ed has a great website. The Higher Education Center at Ohio State is a good resource. Email me anytime. And our website isn't great, but there's a really amazing video on there that a student made interviewing students, and our recently retired Vice President for Student Affairs, Royster Harper, who was a huge recovery support for us. So I'm gonna be done at that now, and I'll turn it over to Carl, and then I can answer questions.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Matt. I'm going to let Carl speak. That was great. Tons of information, and I already got a couple of questions through the comments. So as soon as Carl's done, we'll turn it back to you and others for questions. In the meantime, let's move on and let Dr. Christensen speak about addiction in seniors.
Thanks. My name is Carl Christensen. I'm an addiction doc and a chronic pain management doc in the Ann Arbor area, and I work at Don Farm, and I'm on the advisory board here. There's really two things that I'd like to talk about. The first is chronic pain in senior citizens, and the second would be addiction in senior citizens, and the two can be pretty closely tied together. When I say senior, I mean over 65. When I say old, I mean older than me. So I'm 67, so old means 68. So the first thing is that I caution people is if you're having pain, before you seek a pain treatment, make sure that there's not something more serious going on. I've seen a lot of disasters in my career where people who had common pain complaints had a catastrophic illness. I've seen people with arm pain who are having a heart attack. I've seen people with a migraine who are having a stroke. I had a patient who thought she had bronchitis and it was recurrent uterine cancer. Men who are in their 60s who have sudden onset of back pain need to worry about prostate cancer. And you've all heard stories about people who have irritable bowel actually turning out to have things like ovarian cancer. So even though we're trying to stay away from healthcare professionals right now and stay away from the doc's office, if you have something new and something you're not sure about, make sure you get it checked out. After that, keep in mind that we believe pain really falls into 3 different types of pain. The first is the common kind of pain, which we call nociceptive. And what that means is that your body is filled with pain receptors, and the older you get, the more you appreciate that. And for example, when you have knee pain or musculoskeletal pain, that's coming to your brain through special pain receptors. And it's supposed to have a biologic basis telling you that your body is in danger, but when it gets to be chronic pain, which means 4 to 6 months, then it can kind of take on a life of its own. The second type of pain we call neuropathic pain, and that means nerve pain, and that means the nerve is damaged, squeezed, or somehow being irritated, and the nerve that is supposed to transmit pain signals is causing pain all by itself. And the most common example you would think of would be somebody who has diabetic neuropathy, whose feet feel like they're burning, or somebody who has shingles. Those are the nerves being irritated by the virus returning, or somebody who has sciatica and has a pinched nerve. And that kind of pain is typically treated, we'll talk about, with medications that are considered to be anti-epileptics, and the one that everyone is the most familiar with is gabapentin or Neurontin. And the third one is the one that's very difficult to figure out and treat, and that's something that we would call a central pain syndrome. That means that a patient has somehow become sensitized to part of their body, and even though if you were to do surgery on them, you might not find anything wrong, they're having severe pain, typically from 1 or more parts of their bodies. And it can be also associated with other problems like fatigue and confusion. And the best example of all is probably going to be fibromyalgia. Those patients experience chronic pain. There's no specific disease that can be found, but the pain can be debilitating. You can be confused, fatigued, depressed, and it can take you over. And we also consider other conditions like migraine, chronic abdominal pain, chronic pelvic pain, bladder pain. These can all be considered central pain syndromes. And there's a lot of argument about what the best kind of medication is to treat them, but what we do know is that the medication that you want to stay away from for a patient like that is going to be opioids, okay? So the next thing to talk about would be how do you treat pain? And then we'll get into talking about the pros and cons of opioids. And if you want to classify it, you can have pharmacologic treatment with drugs, and you can have non-pharmacologic treatment. And the non-pharmacologic treatments are considered to be safer, but the problem in our society is that most patients do not have insurance coverage for them. And I'm talking about, you know, chronic physical therapy, massage therapy, acupuncture, chiropractic, craniosacral therapy, all the things that you hear about that deal with mind body or relieving stress on nerves or massage therapy have been shown to help, and they are typically considered much safer than using medications and especially using opioids. But you're going to see that when you try and get your insurance company to pay for it, that's not going to happen. Then you talk about, before talking about medications like opioids, remember that there are pain specialists, anesthesiologists. Your first choice speaker tonight, Dr. Sikorsky, who I notice is a lot younger and better looking than me, he is a pain intervention specialist, and you would go to him and he might offer you something like an epidural steroid injection where they put steroids inside or on the outside of the spinal canal. They may offer something like radio frequency ablation, which is where the nerve is actually burned, and it can be very effective for months until the nerve recovers. And then another specialized treatment that they offer is something called a spinal cord stimulator. It's very similar to what you may have heard of being a TENS unit. They implant electrodes near your spinal nerves, and they can effectively confuse your spinal nerves, and I have patients who get a dramatic reduction in their pain. And next you have to talk about pharmacology. Okay, so pharmacology is really broken down into non-opioid and opioid medication. Non-opioid medication may be things like antidepressants. There's old antidepressants and new antidepressants. The old antidepressants are still used effectively for pain, and that's drugs that you may hear of that are called like Elavil or Pamelor, and they're in the class of drugs called tricyclics. Those medications were actually designed for depression. They help with sleep. No one really knows how much they help or how they help with pain, but you have to keep in mind that now that we're talking about drugs, every drug has bad side effects. And for the tricyclics, you need to worry about effects on your heart. It can affect your heart rhythm. You need to worry about effects on your mouth. I have a patient who was put on a tricyclic for depression and lost her teeth because her mouth became so dry. You have the newer drugs like Cymbalta and Effexor. These are drugs from a special class that we call the SNRIs, the serotonin, norepinephrine, reuptake inhibitors. And what that means in English is that two of the drugs in your brain, serotonin and norepinephrine, will build up when you start taking these medications, and they seem to help with chronic pain. You have to be careful with these drugs. There's a very dangerous syndrome called the serotonin syndrome where you can become hyperthermic, hypertensive, confused, psychotic, stiff, start shaking, and that's a medical emergency. And when you talk about neuropathic pain, we have medications that are in the anti-epileptic category, and the most famous one is going to be gabapentin. Gabapentin currently has a bad rap because it was touted as being more of a solution than it is, and it's an abusable drug. So now in Michigan, it's a controlled substance. There's other anti-epileptics that are not as well known, but these medications help to calm down your nerves and may help with neuropathic type pain. And then coming into the big ones, we have the opioids. And the opioids can be used either for acute or chronic pain. They work for acute pain. We believe that in most cases, they don't work well for chronic pain. And they are dangerous even when taken for acute pain. And one of the biggest researchers in the world is actually here in Ann Arbor, Dr. Chad Brummett, and he did an amazing amount of research looking at people who got short-acting opioids, and he found that people who took pain medications after surgery, for example, 6% of them found themselves dependent on the opioids after as short a period as 3 to 7 days. And there's obviously something going on there. And I think most of us believe that what happens is the patient is at risk for addiction, and the opioid triggers that and turns on their addictive behaviors. But you have to realize that even taking Norco after a tooth extraction can be dangerous. Because of that, you may have experienced this firsthand. Michigan law will only allow a prescriber to give you a week of medication if it's acute pain. If it's chronic pain, you can still get 30 days or more. But you have to realize that if you have risk factors like depression, a history of abuse, a history of tobacco dependence, a history of addiction to other drugs, and you are given even a short prescription of opioids, you may find that you can't come off. So they're not to be taken lightly. If you're talking about things like short-term surgery, sometimes Tylenol and Motrin, high dose in combination for several days, can be very effective. And one thing I forgot to mention was using the nonsteroidals. I skipped over that. They are very effective. They're probably more effective than medications like Tylenol. However, when you take them for a long time, you have a risk of burning out your stomach or damaging your kidneys. There also is an increased risk of having a stroke. Now, for the chronic opioid therapy, when I started doing this about 15 years ago, everybody should be given opioids as much as they need, and whatever it takes to keep them out of pain, that's okay. And actually, there was a law back before 2010 that said, we will prosecute you if you don't give your patient enough opioids. So this was, there's been a dramatic change since then that you've all heard about, and the government and all the professional organizations recommend trying to avoid using opioids for chronic pain. Now there's a different situation in somebody who is already on them. What do you do for them? We went way overboard a few years ago, and we started forcing people off opioids when they had been on them for years. They were stable, and they were physically dependent on them. That was really the only way to look at it. We forced them off. People committed suicide. They started using heroin. They overdosed on illicit drugs, and things got pretty messy. Last year, the government came out with a guideline saying, don't start somebody on opioids if possible, but if somebody's already on opioids, it may be better to leave them on opioids. And this is a good thing, because there are people who have been on opioids for years, and for them to come off is really not going to go well. And if somebody becomes dependent on opioids, a certain percentage of us who take opioids are going to become addicted. And you heard that from Scott. Addiction is not withdrawal. Addiction is craving, loss of control. You focus on that, you're salient, that's all you care about, and it takes over your life, and you continue to use them despite harm. Those folks need some type of treatment for opioid dependence, anything from what we call medication-assisted therapy, which would be buprenorphine or methadone, or opioid blockers like naltrexone or Vivitrol, and that's a whole separate talk. And then I just wanted to finish off by talking a little bit about addiction in seniors. And one of the ways that seniors get addicted is by what we've just been talking about, is they are very often put on opioid medication and they can't come off. And the other dangerous thing that happens for seniors is benzodiazepines, sedatives. Older folks have a lot of loss in their lives. They become anxious, they retire, they are alone, they lose loved ones, and they are taken to their provider and they're upset, angry, anxious, can't sleep, and they walk out with a Xanax prescription. It works fantastic for about 2 weeks. And then it stops working and the dose has to go up, and you still become more anxious and round. And we know a lot of bad stuff about benzodiazepines. One is that they cause dementia, and we believe that it's irreversible. Another is that if you're taking a pain medication, you have a certain risk of overdose, and that benzodiazepine triples the risk of overdose. So it makes pain medications way more dangerous. Benzodiazepines are very difficult to get off of. I have spent years trying to get patients off benzos when they're referred to me, and a lot of times it just never happens. So you have to minimize the risk. So one problem the seniors have is they're exposed to opioids because they have more pain. and another is that because of their lives and what they've gone through, they have more anxiety, insomnia, depression, and they're put on medications that can be very, very addictive. Benzodiazepines are probably one of the worst types of drugs that are out there. And finally, how do you treat this in seniors? A lot of the stuff that we've talked about today has barriers up when you talk about treating a senior. Seniors are much more sensitive to medication. So if you're talking about giving them MAT, which would be buprenorphine or methadone, they're much more sensitive to the side effects. And you are much more likely to have an overdose in someone who has all the medical problems that a senior has. When you talk about the behavioral therapies we've been talking about, the spiritual therapy and the recovery programs and the group counseling, seniors don't feel comfortable in those settings very often. Probably the one place you do see a lot of old cronies is an AA meeting. But if you're talking about group therapy, there are very few places around that I'm aware of that are set up to specifically take care of senior citizens in group psychotherapy. And a lot of times, older people just don't feel comfortable in that kind of scenario. So I have the privilege of finishing with probably the most depressing talk you've heard in a while. So I'll turn it back over to Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christensen. That was great. And by the way, it's not that Dr. Sikorsky was our first choice. It's just that we call on you so often that we felt we had to mix it up a little bit, making sure you understand that. Okay, so I want to open it up to questions. And I think if you send the questions by chat, that would be the best way. And then I can kind of go through, that would allow more people to, I think, participate, because if you just jump in and say things, I think it'll make it harder for people to participate. So, however, I had a question that was raised by Allison Hurst that was directed to Matt Statman in the chat. And because it was kind of lengthy, I'm going to just open it up and ask Allison, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Hi, this is Allison. Hi, Matt. I was just wondering, so I am a MSW student at Wayne State, and I just love what you have done with the Collegiate Recovery Program at U of M. And I didn't know if you had any advice for somebody who is maybe trying to start something up at their university, or if you have maybe, tried to collaborate with other universities and how that's gone. Thank
you. It's good to see you. So over the years, I've had a couple of students approach me from Wayne State. Amanda Kay, who you might know, actually had it rolling at one point. But I don't think that the university ever sort of fully embraced it yet. The way that it's important that we have student voices. The university listens to students more than they will listen to staff or faculty. So you got to get some student voices, and then you get some, find some people on campus who have access to the vice president for student life or some of the regents, and get those students to tell their stories to those people. And that's sort of, it often starts from the bottom up. The other way that I've seen them start is when there are faculty or staff who are interested in creating a program, and they often start doing it as like an add-on to their work. And then once it becomes sustained for a while, then they start arguing to fund it and make it a program. And you can email me. I'm happy to talk to you about it more and help you strategize.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, thank you, Allison and Matt. And I have a question directed from Mary P. Neff, and I believe this is to Dr. Christensen. I saw something in AARP about increased use of CBD and THC products in retirees, especially in Florida. What about that?
So marijuana has two markedly different drugs in it. One is cannabidiol, which is CBD, and the other is THC, which is the part that is euphoric and mood altering. And chronic pain is probably treated through CBD oil. And there is nothing proven about this, but when you talk to patients, you'll find a large number of them get benefits from CBD oil. It's going to have a small amount of THC in it, so if you work in a job where you may be drug tested, you can't use it. You're going to have a very good chance of testing positive for THC. As far as medical marijuana goes, again, that's a whole separate topic, but you have to be very careful because the marijuana that is currently out there is so much different than what was used in research studies, so much stronger than what was typically used by somebody for recreational marijuana, that there's really no comparing it. But CBD oil is available essentially over the counter. If you want to try it, just realize that if you had to do a drug screen, you've got probably a 25% chance of testing positive.
Thank you for that. I have a question for Scott. Scott, could you explain a little bit more about how these alternative peer groups work? I mean, how you get a sufficient group together to create the kind of sort of opposite peer pressure to encourage young people to want to stay in recovery as opposed to go have fun with their peers in high school or what have you, doing non-recovery related things.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question. So one of the things that the APG model really, I think, does effectively is they engage the entire family. So like at Rivers Bend, we have the program built around the IOP. Most of the folks who come through the IOP either engage in the alternative peer group at the beginning as like an add-on to the IOP, or they do it as part of their aftercare. And so the way that it would look is twice per week we meet with the kids, but once per week we meet with the kids and their parents. And often we'll split off with just parents in a separate room, and then the kids will have their own room. But I think it's been successful because we've been able to use it as continued support from the clinical piece. So you've got kids and you've kind of got a captive audience in essence, right? So if we require attendance at a few of those while they're in the IOP, because I can try to describe to them, hey, this will be a great time. It's going to be the best time you'll ever have. And they'll look at me and go, there's no way I'm going. But if we require, their parents require they go to the IOP, we require they attend it there. And then all of a sudden they get pulled in, right? So some of the people who have been through the program can kind of look at them and understand how they feel and just say, hey, how you doing? And it's that positive peer support. And we've been really lucky with the group that we have. We've got a good solid base there. And so it's taken a while to get that, and the difficult piece with that can be, if you get one or two kids who are not positive, that can really have a devastating effect on that group culture. But does that answer your question? Thanks.
Yes, it does answer it. Thank you. I started talking even though I was muted there. I have another question. Thank you for that. I have another question. This is from Nancy Struble to Dr. Christensen. More questions about CBD oil. She says there are brands out there that say that the THC has been removed and will not show up on a drug screen. Is it possible to completely remove the THC from CBD oil, or is that just sales hype?
There's one version out there that is guaranteed free of THC. It's Epidiolex, which is used for the childhood seizures. It costs about $7,000 a month. And the other products I'm aware of, I know of a nurse who bought THC free CBD oil, used it, tested positive at work, and lost her job. And the company refunded her $10 for the oil. So I would say that if you want to try it, you might want to test it yourself, which is still not going to be foolproof. But I think a large number of people don't have to worry about drug testing at the workplace. Those folks are okay. Otherwise, I work with a lot of people in recovery who are healthcare professionals, and I caution them, if you are hit with a random drug screen, everything's going to go sideways if you're testing positive for THC.
Do you know of a place where you can get the oil tested that's reasonably priced?
You would probably just buy a drug testing kit and dilute it, but I mean, or try using it and going for a drug test yourself and see what happens. But a test that's negative today might be positive next week. It's really, as far as a work being safe for your job, I don't think it is.
Thank you. Alfred, you had a couple questions. You want to go ahead and ask your questions?
I'm going to mute myself and let's see what those questions were. One moment. This is for Matt Statman. Do you have any resources at the university, with the university, and from the university experience to be shared with the high schools, especially the material about peer support and the impression that everybody else is having a great time using alcohol and our drugs and getting their work done? And I think this would be a good question for Scott Steenburgh too. So if you could both respond. Do you have anything for the high schools to talk to them?
I mean, Scott might have more than I would. The Association of Recovery Schools is a good resource. So there are, as Scott mentioned, recovery high schools around the country that primarily support young people who have substance use disorders. So I think that would be a good place to start. What do you think, Scott?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think, again, great question. The Association of Recovery Schools is a great resource. Who does really good awareness campaigns is Families Against Narcotics, right? You guys are going into the schools. I know through one of their outreach coordinators and talking to the school, to the high schools and all over the place too. And so, but outside of that, for providing that awareness that, hey, it doesn't have to be this way, I don't know that there's much we can do. And I think when you approach public schools and you try to talk about some of this stuff, to some degree, they don't really want to, they're like, okay, we want to say, we want you to raise awareness, but we don't want to get too involved here.
Thank you for that. And I have a question for Dr. Christensen, which is, how could seniors that need group therapy, how could they be offered that? How could they be reached out to and have that opportunity? Or what would need to happen in order to get something like that set up somewhere?
I know that there were two places that were offering it. One was Chelsea Hospital and the other was Maple Grove out in Bloomfield Hills. And I have no idea if they have survived all this.
Thank you very much.
So Matt, I have a question, sort of a follow-up question on Alfred's about high schools, but it's also about college. It seems to me that the peer pressure thing is huge in either place, probably bigger in college than it is in high school, but still it exists in both places, right? To, as you pointed out, to have fun, to belong, you should be imbibing in something, right? How many students do you have in the recovery, the CRP at the University of Michigan? And what kind of turnover do you have? People who come in and then maybe they go out because they decide this isn't what they want.
So our typical fall and winter semester, I'm working really closely with between 20 and 30 students who are consistently showing up, core group members. And then there are another 20 or 30 people who I'm working with who are sort of bouncing around the edges in any given semester. And of the students who stay sober for more than 6 months, we see very little turnover. But the early sobriety stuff can be a mess. And that's, we keep working with people as long as they want to work with us. So, relapse is not seen as anything other than, okay, let's just keep trying, one thing I wanted to add is that there was a social worker at the adolescent psych unit at University of Michigan who reached out to me, and we've some of our students have been doing Zoom meetings with kids who have been admitted to the psych at U of M, who are in their early teens often. So that's another, it's pretty cool that they're able to do that.
Wow, that's really great.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, are there any other questions? Christine Jones, I don't know if you see her in chat, she mentioned a documentary that she was watching over the weekend called Generation Found, and yes, I have seen that as well, about a community outside Houston that developed an innovative youth addiction recovery community. Yeah, that's a great program, a great documentary. I thought it's by the same people who did the Anonymous People, I believe. So, all right. So it is after 8. The program was scheduled to go from 6:30 to 8. So I think we're done with our program. Although there is one more question here: how would we get in contact with college students for struggling teens? I'm not sure I understand that question. Oh, you mean to have college students reach out to struggling teens? Tanya, you want to state your question?
Yes, my son was actually at U of M psych ward and had been in contact with the college students, but has lost contact. How do we get back in contact with them if he finally decides that he does want help with his substance abuse?
I mean, if he reaches out to me, then I can connect him with students, because they're
Okay.
all willing to talk to other people who are exploring recovery.
Okay, and how do I get in contact with you outside of this?
My email is mattstat
mattstat
at umich.edu.
at umich.edu. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Yep.
All right, I want to thank all of our speakers. It's too bad we're not live, so we could all have a applause. But you all did a great job, and I really appreciate you giving up your time on Monday evening to educate all of us who are attending this meeting. And so that's it for this month. Stay tuned for next month with the coronavirus. We normally have a nice schedule that lays out all of our speakers and what we're talking about, but right now where things are a little up in the air because we're not sure if we're going to be meeting live or if we're going to be meeting by Zoom again. So just stay tuned. Check out our Facebook page and information about our meeting for August. God, I can't believe it's August already. Will be happening then. So have a great night, everybody. And again, thanks so much, and we'll see you next month.
Hey, Lauren,
Yes.
in case anyone is interested, there's going to be an Al-Anon book study on loss. It's from the book Opening Our Hearts, Transforming Our Losses, and it's going to start Wednesday night, and I will post that in the fan Facebook group.
That's great. Thanks so much, Barb. Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night.